look like in the East, where here on planet Earth, Russian disinformation poured into America's already toxic body politic comes with consequences from the new American president who sees Putin as he is, an American adversary devoted to weakening America's defenses. But it has been a long time since we've lived on planet Earth when it comes to having an American president who sees Russia's aggression and hostility for what they are. The former guy famously sided with Putin over American intelligence agencies, refused to accept reporting about bounties being placed on the heads of American soldiers, and at almost every turn refused to utter a single word of disapproval for Russia's autocratic, anti-democratic thug leader. Those days are over. And the two reports released yesterday lay bare the tight alignment in message and mission between Russian intelligence operatives and Trump and his allies. From the ODNI report, quote, a key element of Moscow's strategy this election cycle was its use of people linked to Russian intelligence to launder influence narratives, including misleading or unsubstantiated allegations against President Biden through U.S. media organizations, U.S. officials, and prominent U.S. individuals, some of whom were close to former President Trump and his administration. Who on earth?
So that calculates about $140,000 a month, almost $1.7 million per year. It's a pretty good gig if you've got the right last name.
I mean, he's definitely got some questions that he needs to answer as to what was he doing talking to the Ukrainian leadership at the time when his son has a contract.
This is what they call, people, evidence, not lies, evidence, and there's plenty of it, that Biden, his son, and his brother had a 30-year-long scam to make money, millions, selling his public office. Senator first, vice president second, Ukraine, just a tip of the iceberg.
It would be funny if it wasn't so tragic. The fact that their words echo Russian disinformation to hurt Joe Biden, established beyond any doubt by the two reports declassified yesterday. The only remaining questions center around witting or unwitting acts on their part. The term useful idiots can be slapped on them, and just was by Congressman Sean Patrick Maloney in the last hour, but that feels unfair to idiots. The mainstreaming of the Russian disinformation destroyed careers and reputations. Remember Marie Yovanovitch, the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, who Trump forced out of her post?
I was shocked and devastated that I would feature in a phone call between two heads of state in such a manner where President Trump said that I was bad news to another world leader and that I would be going through some things. So I was, it was a terrible moment. A person who saw me actually reading the transcript said that the color drained from my face. I think I even had a physical reaction.
The harmful results of a smear campaign that was operationalized by Donald Trump, who had Rudy Giuliani in his ear. A campaign all the more significant in the wake of what the ODNI report spells out in terms of the Russian efforts to spread false narratives. Quote, a network of Ukraine-linked individuals took steps throughout the election cycle to damage U.S. ties to Ukraine, denigrate President Biden and his candidacy, and benefit former President Trump's prospects for re-election. That sick feeling in your stomach isn't lunch. It's the unsettling reality that Putin got away with more than anyone understands so far about the last 4 years. And we will spend years unpacking to what extent Trump may have cooperated with Russian objectives and operations. New reports of Trump's shared Russian objectives are where we start this hour with some of our favorite reporters and friends. Pete Strzok is here, former FBI counterintelligence agent. Also joining us, MSNBC international affairs analyst and former U.S. ambassador to Russia. Michael McFaul is back. And Mike Schmidt's here, New York Times Washington correspondent and an MSNBC national security contributor. Whenever I listen to Marie Yovanovitch, I have to start with you, Ambassador McFaul. There was so much carnage to what turns out to have been a Russian disinformation campaign all along, run by Trump and his allies.
You're right. I'm glad you remembered her, by the way, because Ambassador Yovanovitch was just trying to serve America's national interest in a nonpartisan way. And she was thrown under the bus by her own Trump administration. But, you know, elections have consequences. We have a new leader. That's good for Ambassador Yovanovitch. I think that's good for American people in terms of our national security interests. And I think we are in a moment of recovery. And I'm especially pleased, Nicole, that they're publishing this information in the authoritative way that they are, because you and I have talked about these things. We've talked about these things for years. But I think it's really important for the American people to understand the incredible multifaceted campaign that Vladimir Putin launched to try to help Mr. Trump, and so that we don't fall down this rabbit hole again.
You know, Pete Strzok, you were at the FBI when the FBI and Andy McCabe asked questions, and Mike and his colleagues reported on this, broke the story in the New York Times, that there were credible questions about whether it was possible that Donald Trump, again, wittingly or unwittingly, was an agent of Vladimir Putin. You read the end of the Trump presidency. You read what happened 4 years after the Russian attack on the 2016 election, and it's clear that there's something there, isn't it?
I think it absolutely is. And as Ambassador McFaul said, it's just bracingly refreshing to see a report coming out of a competent and open Director of National Intelligence that sets forth the unanimous high confidence conclusions of the intelligence community that this absolutely was not only a second effort by the government of Russia to try and elect President Trump, but that the things we were concerned about in 2016, the things that the FBI and the intelligence community continued to be concerned about all the way through 2020 were real. And I have to tell you, things will continue to come out. The nature of intelligence work is that sources and methods are protected, that you have to keep classified information out of the public eye because you have people's lives at risk, because you have various collection techniques that you can't risk. But as time goes on, those risks change. And I think this is the sort of thing that, while it's not surprising, we should expect to see a continued kind of trickle of things, of hard data, which go to back up the level of enormous concern that we had throughout 2015, 16, and all the way up to the current day.
Mike Schmidt, we found some reporting that you and your colleagues Julian Barnes and Maggie Haberman did in October in the run-up to the election. You guys reported this. The intelligence agencies warned the White House late last year that Russian intelligence officers were using President Trump's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, as a conduit for disinformation aimed at undermining Joseph Biden's presidential run. This according to 4 current and former American officials. The warning, the second former official said, was prompted by a meeting on December 5th between Mr. Giuliani and Andrei Derkach, a Ukrainian member of parliament who takes pro-Kremlin positions. What happened when the intelligence agencies warned the White House late last year that Russian intelligence officers were using Rudy Giuliani as a conduit for disinformation? What did they do?
They didn't do anything. And if anything, they embraced this narrative more and more. And they continued to push it. It did how willing the president was to use a foreign power to undermine a candidate, essentially, accelerating Russian disinformation. And then this document, which shows just how far the Russian reach got into the president's orbit, directly to his lawyer who was out there and pushing this. But putting that all aside, I think the thing that sort of stood out to me is that while the Russian efforts were damaging, it was nothing compared to what the president himself did. And then what he did with his own megaphone, and just the immense power that had to direct his base to question the election and the democracy in the way that they have.
Well, Ambassador McFaul, pick up on that, because what Trump did domestically was adapt Russian disinformation tactics. And as Mike Schmidt's saying, use the singular power of the megaphone of an American president to carry out disinformation. It does not have a tradition in American politics. Its tradition, its roots are Russian.
Well, you're right about that. They are Russian, and obviously amplification matters a lot more than the original disinformation. Although it is important to underscore, just, when you read the report, realize how clever they were. This is another operation. This wasn't stealing emails like we saw in 2016. This was directly reaching out to somebody known to be close to the president, Mr. Giuliani, feeding him that information. He brought a camera crew with him, remember? Did a TV special. So it is directly Russian disinformation, then amplified first and foremost by the president, but also by Mr. Giuliani and others around him. And I want to underscore, it is scary to me that there was not a greater effort to expose this in real time. We know why politically, right? They were politicizing the intel. Mike just said they were briefed about it. I would like to know more, by the way, to what extent Mr. Giuliani in particular was briefed by the FBI about these connections. Maybe that'll come later. But we have to, this is a national security issue. We've got to stop treating this as partisan politics and just everything's okay, in the name of winning elections, because we're going to encounter this from Russia and China and Iran time and time again moving forward.
Well, and Pete Strzok, when you look at who was echoing their messages and who was aligned with the Russian operation, they are familiar characters. They are Devin Nunes, who has been at this intersection of Russian interference and Trump's unwillingness to do anything about it. They are Ron Johnson, who was known to have pressured Christopher Wray for the duration of that sort of final 6 months of Trump's presidency for dirt on Hunter Biden and information about those investigations. I mean, the corruption was carried out. I mean, the corruption of intelligence and the accomplices that Trump had are inside the government still. What do you do about that?
I don't know, Nicole, because that's what concerns me the most. What we're seeing is the placement of party, in some cases, ahead of country. And I've briefed scores of congressmen and women. I have worked in 5 or 6 presidential administrations. The Russians, the Chinese, and others are always going to aggressively conduct intelligence operations. But what I never saw in my life, I never expected to see in my life, was that people inside the U.S. politicians, having been told or having had reason to believe that they were receiving information that was coming from the government of Russia, that was Russian disinformation, that was the result of a Russian intelligence operation, nevertheless took that information with reason to believe that's where it came from and didn't care. Used that to advance their political narrative, placing that narrative ahead of the national security of the United States. And that's staggering to me. It's still staggering to me. That issue hasn't gone away. And in many ways, that issue concerns me much, much more than what the Russians or Chinese are doing, because that's a constant. It's going on. It's always going to go on. But I haven't seen this abdication of patriotism before in my life.
Well, and the abdication of patriotism is something, Mike, that, I mean, your book is aptly titled Donald Trump versus the United States. The ODNI report certainly tells a story of someone versus the United States. Maybe they're Donald Trump's allies and friends, but they are in bed with known Russian agents, and they're named in this report. Konstantin Kilimnik comes up. He's a character from the Mueller probe and the Mueller investigation for his associations with Paul Manafort. Derkach, who we've talked about, met with Ron Johnson, passed things to his office, was photographed there with Rudy Giuliani. I mean, if you can just speak to how successful not just the Russians were, but Donald Trump was in taking and welcoming their political support.
No, the president was completely unshackled in those last 2 years of his administration, and that perfectly positioned him to use people like Giuliani in these efforts and to basically try and attack the American system from within. And I know that sounds, that's an outlandish thing to say, but basically that was what was going on. And it just shows the extreme reach of this and the sort of accelerant that the president provided for the Russian efforts. And as Pete was saying, it was like you couldn't imagine another president doing what Trump did with this stuff. And the other thing is that, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of things that went on in secret that we don't know about, but a lot of this was done out in the open. It was done through the messaging. Rudy Giuliani was very open about what he was doing. He was not trying to hide it. And there's a brazenness to that still shocks me.
And speaking about in the open, I mean, Ambassador McFaul, what President Biden does there in the interview this morning with George Stephanopoulos is he says to Putin, I see you out in the open. I know you have no soul, and at least we understand each other. It is such a dramatic departure from Donald Trump, who I'll never forget being on with my colleague Joe Scarborough, and Joe said, well, Putin kills people. So he says, oh, we're not that innocent. I mean, not only did he never criticize Putin's aggressions, his affection and affinity and subservience to Putin really became the central hallmark of U.S. foreign policy, or at least U.S.-Russia relations. Can you just speak to the substance of what this change in leadership and transfer of power means for the U.S.-Russia relationship?
Well, it's fundamental. I was at that last meeting that the vice president had with Prime Minister Putin back in 2011. Already back then, as he said in his interview yesterday, he knows who Putin is. He's been briefed with him, about him. He's met with him. And remember, President Biden has a deep set of relationships with countries around the region, too. Ukraine, Georgia, Eastern Europe. So Moldova, I traveled to Moldova with the vice president. So he knows, I think, A, the situation very well, unlike the previous president. But B, of course, thank goodness we're not going to have our own president of the United States playing the whataboutism game that you just described, right? Well, what about our killing? That's a classic Putin tactic. I've been in meetings with Putin many, many times. That's what he does. And tragically, we had a president that did it. Now, his administration didn't always do it, by the way. That was a very strange situation we had as well, where the top people at the White House had one Russia policy, the president. The rest of his administration had a different one. Today, we have one policy led by President Biden, and it's going to be radically different, as we just learned yesterday. And I think we will see it unfold as the president promised. There are going to be consequences for what they did. That should be coming shortly.
To your point, Ambassador McFaul, I remember John Bolton saying to me once, I said to him, how, with your views on Putin, can you work for him? And he said, well, if you've got Trump, you should be glad that I'm there. And I guess all that is mercy
to the families of those who have been killed. And it speaks to a larger issue, which is the issue of violence in our country and what we must do to never tolerate it and to always speak out against it. The investigation is ongoing. We don't yet know. We're not yet clear about the motive. But I do want to say to our Asian American community that we stand with you and understand how this has frightened and shocked and outraged.
That was Vice President Kamala Harris, the nation's first Asian American vice president, addressing the tragic shootings in Atlanta that have left 8 people dead, including 6 women of Asian descent. Police say that the motive is unclear, and they have not determined if this was a hate crime. But the attacks have Asian Americans all across this country on edge and frightened. The NYPD is deploying counterterrorism officers to Asian communities throughout the city out of an abundance of caution. The attacks come amid a devastating wave of anti-Asian violence, spurred by racist rhetoric from Donald Trump and the right, attempting to shift blame for the pandemic onto the Asian American community in this country. One group tracking anti-Asian hate says they've received reports of nearly 3,800 incidents since last March, with more than 2/3 of those attacks reported by women. Joining us now is actress Olivia Munn. I see all of your tweets, and I see you speaking out on this, and I'm sorry that it takes a tragedy to have a really important conversation, but I'm so glad to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you for helping us amplify this.
Now, what is the message, and what do you think the disconnect is between people really appreciating and understanding just how targeted and vulnerable Asian Americans feel right now?
I think there is a huge disconnect because culturally, for Asian Americans, we are told to be quiet, to not ruffle any feathers, to not be disruptive. And so there's a lot of underreporting that's happening. Also, there's a lot of underreporting because there's a huge language barrier. So there are people that may want to go to the police and talk about something that has happened to them, but there's no one there that speaks their language. So it becomes a moot point for them. So there's a lot of underreporting that's happening. And so it's really hard for people to understand really what is happening to our people. And right now, when we're seeing it happen, we're all struggling with it. There is, like just today, there have been questions about the shooter's mental health. And, the truth is right now, there is a mental health crisis with Asian Americans. We are being targeted. We are living in a country that is attacking us simply just for being us. And we really don't know what we have to do to get help. We need more people to care about us. We need people to help us amplify this. We need the media to cover it. We need people on social media to denounce this kind of stuff that's happening against us. It's so important that we are heard, because we have been so invisible for so long.
And you're right. I mean, some of that is on us. I mean, we've been covering the pandemic for a year, and I think it's just come to my attention what a crisis this is. So thank you for helping to bring attention to that. And I want to, this is uncomfortable to watch, but I want to just show our viewers what some of these victims have experienced. Let's watch. We'll talk about it on the other side.
They started hurling racial insults. They started calling me Chinese virus.
A gentleman approached me and started yelling racial slurs at me. You dirty Chinese, you damn Chinese, this is you, you dirty Chinese. And he just kept saying that over and over again.
We call Chinese virus. Don't talk to him. Mm-hmm. You're gonna get sick.
He yelled at me on the train and said, you people brought this virus here.
We've heard some reports, even before schools went fully remote, that you had elementary kids telling each other, I don't want to play with that kid because he's Chinese.
I don't want to play with that kid. Olivia, do these stories sound like things that you've heard from within the Asian American community?
Yes. At alarming rates. We hear about it all the time. My mother texts me that she's afraid to go outside. And all of my friends, their families, they were afraid to go out. And what's really scary is that for the longest time they were targeting, all these vicious attacks were targeting, the elderly in our community. And then you see what happened in Atlanta, and there's this other vulnerable group, which is, are these Asian women that are being attacked. And it's a heartbreaking situation for us, because we all went through the pandemic. The whole world, we all experienced the same thing. But within that, there was this other pandemic, this that happened against our people. We are being attacked, and it's because leaders have decided to not use the scientific name for the virus and instead call it the Kung flu or the China virus, and they put a target on our back. And it can't be open season for Asians right now. We need help. We need so much help. And everybody saw that. Everybody heard our president targeting Asians by using that rhetoric. And we were all in the pandemic, and no one really knew what was going to happen. When he was saying that, it was hard for me. It was hard for my family, but we had no idea that it would play out like this. And also, when you think about how hard the pandemic has been for people, there's a lot of frustration. And what we know with human nature is that a lot of times people are looking for someone or something to blame. And this is just a very easy scapegoat for a lot of people's frustrations of what has happened over the past year.
Well, and Olivia, I think you put all the pieces together. From the beginning, the former president called it the Kung flu and the China virus up till last night. On Fox News, he did it again. So that hasn't stopped. I wonder what you think the best antidote is. He still has a pretty big following and a big megaphone. What do you need from elected officials to push back against that smear?
We need our elected officials to speak up about this and to denounce these horrible hate crimes against the Asian community. We need people to use their platforms and use their megaphones to say how wrong this is. We need our pain to be seen.
Olivia Munn, you've brought a lot of attention to this, including ours. Thank you for spending some time with us. Please come back.
Thank you so much.
Ready to debate the For the People Act, the most expansive voting rights legislation since the civil rights era. Republicans across this country are attempting to pass waves of anti-voting measures motivated by the big lie that there was rampant voter fraud in the 2020 election. We all know there was none. One state that has led the way in peddling the big lie is Texas, where currently more than 24 GOP-sponsored bills are under consideration in that state's legislature, where everything from tightening voter ID laws to limiting early voting is up for consideration. The legislation is finding support from the very top of the Texas government after Governor Greg Abbott declared, quote, election security a priority on Monday, making it very likely that some of these bills will be enacted this year. Let's bring into our conversation Matthew Dowd, political strategist and founder of Country Over Party, and Eugene Daniels, White House reporter and co-author of Politico's Playbook. And we are thrilled to get to announce here on this show that Eugene is now part of the MSNBC family as a political contributor here. Eugene, welcome and thank you. And just talk about these sort of tectonic plates pushing against each other. Republicans not rooted in fact, not rooted in anything that the Trump administration or the Trump Justice Department could find as any evidence of widespread voter fraud, but moving ahead and changing laws and taking away access to the right to vote built on a lie.
Exactly. In Texas, like you talked about, it feels pretty clear they're working on fixing a problem that doesn't actually exist. Governor Abbott himself said he himself is not aware of any fraud that occurred in Texas that's big enough to change any of the elections that happened. And I want to read his quote because it's telling. Right now, I don't know how many or if any elections in the state of Texas in 2020 were altered because of voter fraud. And that's really key because the follow-up question is, so what are you trying to solve for? What are the policies meant to do, and who are they attempting to impact? And then you have here in D.C., you have H.R. 1, which has passed the House. You also have H.R. 4, which is the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. And so there's all, like you said, these tectonic plates. They're meeting in the middle. And around the country, you have 250 bills that are restricting voting rights all over, whether it's voter ID laws or changing how people can actually send in their no excuse absentee ballot and all types of things. And it's something that for Black and brown people, we know that it's going to affect them disproportionately, especially in states like Texas, because some of these laws seem squarely pointed at Harris County, which is where Houston is.
Mm-hmm. So I grew up on the San Andreas Fault, Matthew Dowd. So what tectonic plates that rub together do is they result in tragic earthquakes. And it feels like the earthquake here is a pessimistic one. It feels like a lot of people think that these Republican legislatures are going to pass restrictions on voting rights based on a lie. What can be done to push back in the other direction?
First, happy St. Patrick's Day. As you can see, I'm wearing my Detroit Irish T-shirt.
Yeah, I see it.
And if you're from Detroit and you're Irish, it means you have a chip on each shoulder. So that's the way we are. So,
I remember those chips.
Yes, you do. You deal with facts. Let me here's what's amazing about it, and it's especially true in Texas. In the last 50 years, Nicole, there's been around 1,500 proven instances of voter fraud in the last 50 years. Out of 3 billion votes cast, 1,500 instances of proven voter fraud in the United States. In the same 50 years, 1.5 million people have died from guns. Same 50 years, 1.5 million people. And the Republicans, and in Texas, are more interested in putting restrictions and limits on voters than they are interested in putting restrictions and limits on guns, which is an amazing situation to be in right now. And I think, as you've talked about before, and as I know you and I have discussed, it's an instance of the Republicans do think they're trying to fix a problem. It's not the problem of voter fraud, because they know deep down that doesn't really exist and it's not really happens, and our election was secure and a record number of people voted. They're trying to fix a political problem. And the political problem here in Texas is trending from deep red to light red, and it's about to become purple. And eventually, because of demographics and the position of the Republican Party, it's going to be blue. And the Republicans know that as Texas moves, the only way they can preserve the offices, and to me, Texas is the ball game for our country politically. As soon as Texas becomes purple, it changes the nature of everything in the Electoral College and the United States Senate and all that. And I think the Republicans here understand that. They hold every statewide office, 18 statewide offices here. They hold them all. They hold the legislature, but they know it's being chipped away by demographics. And so their goal is to preserve a voting bloc in the state that is positive for them. So they know there's a problem. It's just not voter fraud.
Matthew, you blew my mind. You need to say that one more time. The instances of voter irregularities and fraud and gun violence.
In the last, I'll say it again, in the last 50 years, there's been 1,500 instances of proven voter fraud out of almost 3 billion votes cast. In the same 50 years, there's been 1.5 million deaths by guns.
It's unbelievable. I guess I want to follow up with you, Matthew, on, I spent more time in the Republican Party than you did, but how do you read this as anything other than a party that has just dramatically and publicly and brazenly broken bad?
Well, I was thinking about this, and I watched your early segment, and obviously the awful stuff that happened in Georgia. And to me, there's no question in my mind that was racially motivated. I don't care about somebody's sex addiction. The guy went to massage parlors that were run by Asian people. He didn't go to strip joints. He didn't go to, and the fact that the Republicans don't seem to care about any of this white supremacist movement is, I was thinking about this. It's Donald Trump showed that Donald Trump could behave in any way he wanted. He basically was somebody in the military trying to get a Section 8, and he was successful. So he acted crazy, he was successful. Now every other Republican sees that he was successful, so they're all going for their Section 8, which means they're going to act as crazy or crazier than possible. And here in Texas, Governor Abbott has an interest in running for president, which is why he's doing crazy stuff like trying to restrict voter rights. It's why Ron Johnson is doing crazy stuff in Wisconsin. It's why these crazy Congress people are doing it, is because they saw a president succeed on getting a Section 8. And they were like, okay, if he acted crazy and was successful, I'm going to act even crazier.
That is exactly where we are. Eugene, today on the floor of the Senate, Senator Raphael Warnock gave his first speech on the Senate floor, and it was this rousing call to action around voting rights. And it gets complicated around the filibuster. But what is the hope? What is the level of optimism that that legislation could, in part, push back against what's happening in state legislatures?
It really helps when you're a reverend, when you hit that Senate floor to give one of those rousing speeches.
It does.
The more people I talk to, Democrats, they're not very optimistic, right? Because you have this filibuster still happening. You have people like Kristen Sinema. You have Joe Manchin, who don't seem like they're going to budge on reforming the filibuster at all, even though President Biden talked about yesterday that he would be open to allowing folks to go ahead and do the talking filibuster. But the key is that doesn't automatically change the voting that you need, the votes that you need to pass bills. And so what I continue to hear, and I wrote about earlier this week in Playbook, is that Black and brown people and people who work in this space on voting, they're going to concentrate on pushing this idea that this is about the voting rights of Black and brown people in this country. You can either protect the filibuster, they say, or you can make sure that Black and brown people in this country are allowed to vote. And for Democrats, it's not just a moral obligation, they say, it's also about power. Because if Black and brown people in this country can't vote, then Democrats don't have power. And so none of the other things that they want to get done will matter. Infrastructure won't matter because you won't be the president, the House, and the Senate. It won't matter if you want to do something on climate change because you won't have the presidency, the House, and the Senate because Black and brown people won't be able to vote. And so the advocates are pushing this. And so we will see how long Democrats will be able to hold this off. But advocates don't seem to be giving up, and they're going to be pushing, I think, even harder than Democrats expect at this point.
Nicole, can I say one thing?
It's very interesting. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Because it's St. Patrick's Day and it's a day, obviously, us Irish celebrate, I think it's important to reflect that this idea of voter restrictions has been with us. We all know about what Jim Crow, and we all know about civil rights, and we know the Chinese Exclusion Act, and we know what's happening to Asians. But basically every single immigrant, including the Irish, when they came here, were confronted with the same exact thing. Voter registration laws were put in place in the 1800s because of the wave of immigrants, including Irish and Italian and Germans, were put in place, and the powers that be didn't like that. They were going to assume and start taking power just for Latinos. It happened to Latinos. It's happened to blacks. It's happened to every single group. And every person in your audience, I'm willing to bet 95%, has some linkage or some ancestry to a group that was mistreated. So the idea that just because we're white, it's not somehow impacting us because we're not in the current crosshairs of it. We've been in the crosshairs in the history of our country, and every time this happens, the only way we can succeed in this is other groups have to join the groups of black and brown people, of Asian people, because we were confronted with this in years past, and the only way we were able to succeed is we bound together. So that's important, I think, to keep in mind.
Always bringing it back to a historical frame. This was a pleasure. Can we make this a regular thing? Matthew Dowd and Eugene Daniels, thank you both so very much, and happy St. Patrick's Day to you. Matthew, congratulations to you, and welcome to our motley, fun-loving family here at MSNBC, Eugene. When we return...